Right now, let's talk to Jotam Confino, Middle East correspondent, of course, because we got news last night, this was from CNN, that Israel and Hamas appears to be on the brink of a framework agreement, it says here, for a ceasefire and a hostage release deal. So let's find out precisely what is going on. Jotam, very good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I mean, I don't want to say things have gone a bit quiet in Israel over the course of the last couple of weeks, but it does seem as though we haven't been seeing quite so many stories coming out of Gaza and quite so many stories coming out of Israel. I'm sure it's not quiet when you're there, but tell us what's happening and what the latest is.
So the latest is that Hamas is apparently ready to negotiate further with Israel, and it says that it's looking positively at some of the new details, the new changes to a proposed ceasefire deal that has been being mediated by Egypt and by Qatar. But I have to say we have to be very cautious with the optimism when it comes to these news, these stories about Hamas changing their position or maybe being more flexible, because we've been here many, many times before. What Hamas is saying is that it is ready for a ceasefire if there's a guarantee that Israel won't attack Hamas again, ever, a permanent ceasefire. Right. Now, which kind of guarantee can you get? They're looking for a guarantee from Iran and from Russia and from states that they are allied with. But Israel will never agree to that. So I'm being very cautious when I'm saying that there's grounds for optimism whenever these news break.
Yes, indeed, because I seem to remember the last time we were told there was a ceasefire agreement in place, it was coming out of Egypt, and it was Hamas who said that they had agreed a ceasefire, when in fact Israel hadn't even been contacted and asked about it.
Exactly. Last time what happened was actually that Hamas agreed to something that wasn't actually on the table. Right. They agreed to something that they had put out themselves. So this is all about spinning the narrative. And again, obviously, it's good to hear that they're ready to talk again, and especially for the families of the hostages and for the civilians in Gaza. But at the end of the day, there's one man who decides on Gaza and Israel's future when it comes to this war. And that is the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, who is underground, who hasn't been seen out in daylight for 9 months. Right. And it's his choice, really. He needs to decide whether he wants to actually have a ceasefire with Israel, where there'll be a permanent ceasefire, but he won't get everything that he wants, which is, of course, to continue ruling Gaza.
Right. And in terms of the IDF sort of incursions into Gaza and the IDF's operations in Gaza, I presume they're still ongoing, are they?
They are, and sadly, people are being killed every day, both civilians, but also Israeli soldiers. Just yesterday, we had news about more soldiers being killed in Gaza. What Israel is doing right now is more of surgical attacks. It isn't. First of all, they withdrew a lot of their soldiers because they're preparing for an eventual war with Hezbollah in the north. So they withdrew a lot of soldiers from Gaza. And what they're doing now is they're going after Hamas at specific areas, both in the central part of the Gaza Strip, but also in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And that's why we saw Israel trying to evacuate a lot of people from one of the big cities, Khan Yunis, this week. So the attacks are still ongoing, but Hamas seems to be able to still fire rockets at Israel 9 months into this war, which is quite extraordinary.
Yes, absolutely right. And here's the interesting thing as well, because, you know, as much as you would expect that the IDF would know where Hamas operatives are and where those missile sites might be, it seems like a very, very laborious and complicated situation, because this has now been going on since October. And you would have thought, I would have thought anyway, and many people would have thought, that Israel would have wiped Hamas out by now.
I agree. I think, first of all, the Israelis were also surprised how embedded Hamas is in the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. It is everywhere, from hospitals to schools to mosques, underground, above ground, UN facilities. And 2 million, if you can hide behind 2 million people, you have a very good chance of confusing the enemy and, of course, prolonging this urban guerrilla warfare as it's become. If you look at other wars, like, for example, the United States attacking Islamic State in Mosul or other places, those were far less complicated areas. Gaza is currently, by far, the most complicated area for any power to battle a terrorist organization that isn't dressed in uniforms.
And is it right that parts of Palestine as well, away from the fighting, are actually sort of operating as normal. You know, food's getting there. People are going to markets and buying food every single day. People are willing to, able to live relatively normal lives.
In Gaza, I wouldn't call it normal, but it isn't as bad as it was just a couple of months ago.
Right.
First of all, we also got the report last week that said that the famine that was predicted actually isn't taking place. There is no famine. That
Right.
being said, it doesn't mean that they're living in luxury. Many of the places are extremely hard hit. First of all, because the areas are completely bombarded. But in terms of humanitarian aid, hundreds of trucks come into Gaza every single day, and now thousands of trucks are actually waiting on the Gazan side of the border to be distributed.
Right.
But the UN has a very hard time actually getting the aid out to civilians for some reason.
Right. And obviously we're in the midst of an American presidential race, basically. It's July the 4th today. Joe Biden may or may not step down and not become the front runner for the Democrats. They may give that job to somebody else. What does Benjamin Netanyahu do, and how does he react if Donald Trump, one, wins, but also if Biden sort of takes himself out of the race?
I think it's a good question, because you would think that Netanyahu and Trump have a good relationship. They don't. They used to have a good relationship, but at the very end of Trump's presidency, it really soured because Netanyahu really pulled a fast one on Trump. He did many things that Trump really didn't care for, such as announcing that he wanted to annex the West Bank and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, Biden is probably one of the most pro-Israel presidents ever in U.S. history. So for Israel in general, having Trump coming in is not necessarily a good thing, but for Netanyahu, I think he will be able to maybe handle Trump in a better way that he's handling Biden, because Biden has known Netanyahu for 30 years, and he's very consistent in the way that he's handling Netanyahu in a critical way.
Right. But I was going to say, I mean, you know, of late, you might have said that if you were an observer from looking on from the outside, that Biden actually has been quite critical of Israel and quite critical, generally speaking, of the way Israel has prosecuted the war.
But rightly so. Biden is the United States president. He's not the president of Israel. He needs to, first of all, look out for U.S. interests. And when he sees that Netanyahu and his government are making insane comments about the Palestinians, that he sees that Netanyahu sometimes is torpedoing maybe the ceasefire negotiations, that's not in the U.S. interest at all. There are American hostages inside Gaza. So they are pushing the boundaries constantly, the Netanyahu government, in terms of what Biden can accept really as a U.S. president. So I think overall, Israel could not have had a better president than Joe Biden, I think, in terms of support.
Right. And as far as the Netanyahu government goes, you know, we saw Benny Gantz quitting the sort of the Defense Solidarity Committee some weeks ago. How's that all going?
Well, first of all, Gantz is positioning himself for the day after Netanyahu. He's looking to be the next prime minister, possibly. Depends on who's entering the race, but if the political landscape stays as it is right now, whenever the day comes where there'll be election, Benny Gantz will likely be the next prime minister. So he's trying, of course, now to attack Netanyahu, and at the same time trying to stay relevant in Israeli politics. A lot can happen. We know for example that the Netanyahu government doesn't have to call elections for another 2 years. So in theory, it could stay for another 2 years in power. Right. And 2 years in Israel is abysmal amount of time. A lot can happen, but Benny Gantz is still very relevant and quite popular, I would say, in Israel. Right.
And would you say that Netanyahu now is not very popular at all?
He isn't, but he isn't. He's actually gaining. He's gaining some popularity, if you could call it that. He dropped significantly in polls the first 4 or 5 months, and then slowly but surely he's regaining some of those votes according to polls. But he wouldn't win an election tomorrow, for example. Right. And I think the fact that Netanyahu still has not been able to personally take responsibility for this absolute scandal that October the 7th was, that's something that very few Israelis can forgive. As a prime minister, you need to take responsibility for a massive scandal that's still destroying the country in many ways.
And you say massive scandal. Do you mean by that you know the Israeli security didn't see it coming or allowed it somehow to happen?
That, but also his, I would say for sure, but also his strategy towards Hamas. For years, Netanyahu allowed Hamas to grow stronger. He allowed millions of dollars to be sent from Qatar in suitcases into Gaza, into Hamas. That was part of his plan to divide the Palestinians, to have Hamas growing stronger at the detriment of the Palestinian Authority. That's something he's been very open about. That strategy, we can conclude, obviously, was horrendous. It was a very, very big miscalculation of what would end up happening. Hamas became so strong that they managed to cause the biggest damage on Israel in its history.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier Hezbollah up in the north coming in from Lebanon. How likely then is a second sort of front conflict then?
I think it's very likely. Just the other day, the second in command of Hezbollah said that if there is a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, then Hezbollah would be able to stop its daily attacks on Israel. We have to remember that Hezbollah has attacked Israel on a daily basis with thousands of rockets and drones and anti-tank missiles for 9 months. But if there's a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, Hezbollah will stop. But it doesn't look like there'll be a ceasefire now. And that means that Israel is running out of time. It cannot justify to the Israeli public that 9 months into this war, 60,000 Israelis are still internally displaced along the northern border with Lebanon, and that daily you have rockets flying over civilian areas in northern Israel. So I think that in the coming weeks, Israel will have to launch an invasion of Lebanon if there is no ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
Right. Interesting stuff. Jotam, thank you very much indeed. Jotam Confino, Middle East correspondent there, reporting in from Israel about the situation regarding Benjamin Netanyahu, the Trump administration possibly coming in, and of course what's going on in Lebanon.